Welcome back to Sean Thinking Out Loud. I'm Sean Armstrong. Today we're going to talk about a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, usually by people who know just enough history to embarrass themselves in public. Brown shirts. You hear it tossed around every election cycle. Somebody doesn't like a candidate, so that candidate's supporters are brown shirts. Somebody doesn't like a rally, so everyone at the rally is brown shirts. Somebody sees an American flag, a truck, a red hat, or a man who still knows how to change a tire, and suddenly we're allegedly looking at Weimar Germany with better Wi-Fi. But the term actually means something. The brown shirts weren't just people with rude opinions. They weren't just people who voted the wrong way. They weren't just citizens who believed things that made the educated class clutch its pearls hard enough to crack a rib. The brown shirts, the SA, were a political street force. They used intimidation, they used violence, they disrupted political opponents. They turned public political life into a contest of fear. They made normal civic engagement dangerous. That's the point. And if we're going to use that term, then we need to talk about tactics, not vibes, not emotional reactions, not partisan panic, tactics. Because here's the ugly truth. A lot of modern political discourse isn't built around persuasion anymore. It's built around coercion. Not, I disagree with you. Not, here's why your argument is wrong. Not, let's debate the issue. No, it's, you shouldn't be allowed to speak. You should lose your job. You should be shouted down. You should be banned. You should be labeled dangerous. You should be socially erased. And if a mob has to show up to make that happen, well, apparently that's just democracy now, which is interesting, because democracy used to involve voting, debate, argument, persuasion, and the peaceful transfer of power. Now, for some people, democracy means letting the loudest group with the most emotional damage and the least self-control decide who gets to speak. That's not democracy, that's mob rule with better branding. And today, we're going to focus on certain factions on the political left that have spent years accusing the right of fascism while openly flirting with tactics that belong to the authoritarian political behavior. Not every person on the left. Let's get that out of the way right now. Before some genius clip 15 seconds of this and pretends I said everyone left of Ronald Reagan is wearing a brown uniform in the garage. No. There are liberals who still believe in civil liberties. There are Democrats who believe in free speech. There are people on the left who understand that if your argument needs a mob to protect it, your argument probably sucks. But there are also factions on the left that don't believe in free speech as a principle. They believe in speech as a weapon. They believe their speech is justice and your speech is violence. They believe their protest is democracy and your protest is extremism. They believe their outrage is moral clarity and your outrage is hatred. They believe intimidation is wrong unless they're doing it. Then it becomes accountability. That word gets used a lot. Accountability. Beautiful little word. Sounds clean. Sounds responsible. Sounds mature. Then you watch how it gets used online and realize that it often means destroy this person until they submit. Because apparently we needed a softer word for social execution. This episode has 5 parts. First, we're going to talk about what the original brown shirts actually did, because history matters, and no, reading 3 memes about Hitler doesn't count as scholarship. Second, we're going to look at campus mobs, public disruptions, and the modern political veto by force. Third, we're going to talk about projection, the habit of accusing your enemies of doing exactly what you're doing yourself. Fourth, we're going to get into social media, cancellation, and the digital mob. Fifth, we're going to talk about political violence, polarization, and where this goes if people don't get a grip. Then we'll close with a line that matters most. Protest is legitimate, coercion isn't. Disagreement is legitimate, threatening people into silence isn't. Calling yourself anti-fascist doesn't magically clean the fascist stink off your tactics. And that's where the discussion begins. Not with the uniform, not with the slogan, not with the side claiming moral superiority, with this tactic. Because if your politics require intimidation, you're not defending democracy. You're training people to fear disagreement. And once that becomes normal, you don't have a republic anymore. You have a pressure campaign pretending to be a conscience. Before we get into segment one, let me take a minute to plug one of my books. If today's topic hits the nerve, it should hit, then you need to check out The American Left, From Liberalism to Despotism. This book tracks how American left moved away from older liberal ideas like individual rights, constitutional limits, open debate, and free inquiry, and drifted toward bureaucracy, identity politics, coercion, and moralized control. It's not a polite little coffee table book for people who want to pretend everything is fine. It's a serious look at how political movements change, how institutions get captured, and how language gets weaponized until liberty starts sounding dangerous and control starts sounding compassionate. You can find The American Left, From Liberalism to Despotism on Amazon and other major book platforms. Read it if you still believe political words should mean something.
Every time I tried to stand, they pushed me down. Now I've had enough, can't take it all around. It's time to be strong, time to be clear. No more being used, it's time to repair. No more Mr. Nice Guy, I'm through. Time to stand up, let the world see. No more being weak, it's time to break. I'm done with the pain, I'll take my place.
Let's start with history. Because if we're going to use the term brown shirts, we should at least know what the hell we're talking about. The brown shirts were the SA, the Sturmtalon, a paramilitary organization attached to the Nazi Party in Germany. They weren't a debating club. They weren't an edgy youth movement. They weren't misunderstood boys who needed better after-school programming. They were political enforcers. Their purpose was to protect Nazi meetings, march in Nazi rallies, intimidate opponents, disrupt opposing parties, and use street violence as a political tool. That matters, because the core of brown shirt politics isn't a particular shade of shirt, it's the method. Threaten, disrupt, intimidate, make opponents afraid to gather, speak, organize, or participate. Turn politics into physical pressure. Make the normal citizen think twice before expressing an unpopular opinion. That's the model. The mistake people make today is thinking fascism begins with marching columns and official uniforms. It doesn't. It begins with permission. Permission to hate the political enemy. Permission to treat disagreement as danger. Permission to believe your cause is so righteous that normal rules no longer apply. Permission to use fear because debate is too slow. Permission to decide that some people don't deserve rights because they're on the wrong side of history. That phrase, by the way, should make every serious person suspicious. The wrong side of history. That's one of those phrases people use when they want to stop arguing and start condemning. It sounds intellectual, but most of the time it means I've decided the future belongs to me, so your rights are now negotiable. No thanks. History doesn't need you as a press secretary. The brown shirts operated in a broken political environment. Germany after World War I was unstable. The Weimar Republic was politically divided, economically damaged, humiliated by defeat, and filled with radical factions fighting in the streets. People were angry, people were scared, people were looking for enemies. That's the kind of environment where political violence starts to look attractive to weak minds. When institutions lose legitimacy, mobs gain power. When courts, elections, newspapers, universities, police, and legislators are no longer trusted, people start outsourcing justice to the street. And once the street becomes judge, jury, and executioner, the whole society starts to rot. Now here's where people get stupid. They hear brown shirts and think the comparison only works if the modern group matches the Nazis in every ideological detail. That's not how tactical comparison works. If I say a group is using brown shirt tactics, I'm not saying they've occupied the entire Nazi platform. I'm not saying they're planning a beer hall push next Thursday after yoga. I'm not saying every activist has a sign with a sign is Heinrich Himmler with student loans. I'm saying the method matters. If your group uses intimidation to control public space, that's a brown shirt tactic. If your group uses mob pressure to prevent opponents from speaking, that's a brown shirt tactic. If your group threatens people into silence, that's a brown shirt tactic. If your group treats political opponents as enemies who must be socially destroyed rather than citizens who must be argued with, that's authoritarian behavior. You don't get to dodge that by saying your cause is noble. Everybody thinks their cause is noble. The SA thought their cause was noble too. So did communists, so did Maoists, so did every revolutionary movement that fed people into prisons, camps, graves, or social ruin while telling itself it was building a better future. The body count of history is full of people who are absolutely certain they were the good guys. That's why moral certainty is not enough. You need moral restraint. The real question isn't, does this group call itself fascist? Almost nobody calls themselves fascist anymore. The real question is, what do they do when they encounter opposition? Do they argue? Do they debate? Do they organize peacefully? Do they vote? Do they write? Do they persuade? Or do they threaten, intimidate, silence, swarm, dox, harass, disrupt, and destroy? That's the test. Because freedom doesn't die only when a dictator signs a document. Sometimes freedom dies when ordinary people learn that expressing the wrong opinion will cost them their job, their friends, their safety, or their reputation. That's how fear becomes social policy. Nobody has to pass a law. The mob handles it. And this is where the modern left has a serious problem. Again, I'm not talking about every person who votes Democrat. I'm talking about activist factions, ideological institutions, media enablers, campus radicals, professional outrage merchants, and online mobs that believe speech is violence, and therefore violence against speech is justified. Once you accept that premise, you can justify anything. If speech is violence, then shutting down speech becomes self-defense. If disagreement is harm, then censorship becomes compassion. If dissent is oppression, then intimidation becomes justice. And if the person you oppose is a fascist, then anything you do to that person becomes resistance. That's the trick. Label the target as evil, then every tactic becomes acceptable. You don't have to win the argument. You just have to make the person untouchable. You don't have to prove your position. You just have to make disagreement socially dangerous. That's not liberalism. That's not democracy. That's not civic courage. That's political cowardice wearing a moral costume. A free society depends on people being allowed to say things other people hate. That's the whole point. Nobody needs free speech to say puppies are cute, murder is bad, and politicians lie. Free speech exists for the hard cases, for offensive views, for unpopular arguments, for minority opinions, for people who are wrong, for people who might be right but are inconvenient, for people who challenge the fashionable lie. And when a movement decides that certain ideas can't be heard, that movement has stepped out of democratic politics and into coercive politics. It may still use democratic language. It may still talk about justice, equity, compassion, safety, inclusion, and dignity. But if the method is intimidation, the language is just decoration. A hammer doesn't become a violin because you paint music notes on it. So when I use the phrase brown shirt tactics, I'm talking about political behavior that tries to control public life through fear. That fear can be physical, it can be professional, it can be social, it can be digital, it can be reputational, it can be legal intimidation, it can be mob pressure, but the goal is the same. Make opposition too costly, make silence safer than speech, make people censor themselves before the mob has to do the work. That's the real victory of intimidation. Not when people are punished, when people get quiet because they saw what happened to the last poor bastard who spoke up. That's how you train a society. And once a society is trained to be afraid of disagreement, it's already halfway cooked. Now let's move into the modern version. One of the clearest places to see this is the college campus, which is fitting because colleges are supposed to be where young adults learn how to think. Instead, some campuses have become expensive daycare centers for ideological fragility with meal plans and administrative cowardice. The old idea of the university was simple: expose students to difficult ideas, make them read hard books, make them argue, make them defend positions, make them learn that being offended isn't the same thing as being injured. That was the theory. Then reality walked in, tripped over a diversity statement, and hit its head on the safe space sign. The modern campus speech fight is not really about whether students have the right to protest. They do. Students can protest speakers. They can hold signs. They can ask hard questions. They can write responses. They can organize counter events. They can stand outside and make their disagreement clear. That's legitimate. That's political speech. That's part of civic life. But there's a line, and the line is this: you don't get to stop other people from hearing the speaker. You don't get to storm the building. You don't get to block entrances. You don't get to threaten attendees. You don't get to burn property. You don't get to use violence and then pretend you were just participating in democracy. That's not protest. That's a veto by force. Take Berkeley in 2017. A conservative speaker was scheduled to appear. There were large protests. Most of those protesters weren't violent. That matters. But a group of masked agitators showed up and turned the event into chaos. Fires, property destruction, objects thrown, police concerns. The event was canceled. That's the formula. You don't need a majority to shut down speech. You need a small group willing to create enough disorder that authorities decide the safest option is cancellation. And once that works, it becomes a lesson. The lesson isn't we had a debate and won. The lesson is we made the event impossible. That's a dangerous lesson, because once people learn they can win by creating chaos, they'll create more chaos. Human beings aren't complicated here. Reward a behavior and you get more of it. This isn't advanced political science. This is basic training for anyone who's ever dealt with children, dogs, soldiers, or politicians. Now, the defenders of this behavior always have the same response. They say, well, the speaker was dangerous. Fine, make the argument. They say the speaker's views were hateful. Fine, challenge the views. They say the speaker made marginalized students feel unsafe. Fine, hold a counter event, write a rebuttal, ask questions, expose the weakness in the argument. But when the solution is to make the event physically impossible, you're not protecting debate. You're ending debate. And if your idea can't survive the existence of a speaker you dislike, your idea is weaker than you think. The campus matters because it trains the future professional class. The student who learns that shouting down a speaker is activism becomes the employee who thinks HR should punish coworkers for opinions. The student who learns that emotional discomfort equals harm becomes the journalist who treats disagreement as danger. The student who learns that ideological opponents should be deplatformed becomes the bureaucrat who thinks licensing, accreditation, funding, and institutional access should be used as political weapons. People don't leave these habits at graduation. They take them into institutions: media, law, education, corporate human resources, government agencies, nonprofits, publishing, entertainment, tech platforms. That's how campus culture becomes national culture. Not all at once, not with one dramatic speech, but slowly, person by person, policy by policy, coward by coward. And the cowardice matters, because mobs only get power when institutions yield. A mob can yell outside a building. That's annoying, but not fatal. The fatal part comes when administrators say, we support free speech, but that but is where freedom goes to die. We support free speech, but safety. We support free speech, but inclusion. We support free speech, but community values. We support free speech, but we must consider harm. Translation, we support free speech until somebody complains loudly enough. And once that becomes policy, the most fragile, aggressive, emotionally unstable faction in the room gets a veto over everyone else. That's not compassion, that's administrative surrender. There's another trick here. People will say actions have consequences. Yes, they do. That's one of those phrases that sounds profound until you realize it can be used to justify almost anything. If someone says something unpopular and people criticize them, that's a consequence. Fine. If someone says something foolish and others refuse to buy his book, that's a consequence. Fine. But if someone says something politically unpopular and a mob tries to get him fired, banned, investigated, threatened, or made unemployable, that's no longer ordinary consequence. That's coercive punishment. And if the punishment is designed to scare everyone into silence, then the real target isn't the one person. The real target is public speech. This is why intimidation doesn't have to involve a punch to the face. A person can be intimidated by a mob outside his event. A person can be intimidated by hundreds of messages threatening his job. A person can be intimidated by being labeled a bigot, fascist, racist, transphobe, Nazi, or domestic terrorist for holding a policy position millions of normal people hold. A person can be intimidated by seeing others destroyed for asking basic questions. That's the modern version. You don't need a brown uniform. You need a smartphone, a hashtag, a willing HR department, and enough angry people with empty afternoons. Welcome to progress. Now, to be fair, the right isn't innocent of political intimidation. There are people on the right who have threatened school boards. There are people on the right who've harassed election workers. There was January 6th, and pretending that didn't happen is unserious. Political violence and intimidation from the right exist. They should be condemned. No hesitation, no excuses, no team sport nonsense. But here's the problem. The left often uses right-wing misconduct as a moral shield for its own conduct. The argument becomes the right did something bad, therefore our behavior is resistance. No, that's not how principles work. You don't defend free speech only when your side is speaking. You don't condemn political violence only when your enemy commits it. You don't oppose intimidation only when it's aimed at people you like. If the principle changes based on your who benefits, it's not a principle, it's a preference, and preferences are cheap. The veto by force is one of the most dangerous habits in a republic. Because once people believe disruption is a valid way to silence opponents, every political event becomes a potential battlefield. Every speaker becomes a target. Every audience becomes suspect. Every police presence becomes part of the show. And normal citizens pull back. They stop attending. They stop speaking. They stop debating. They stop putting signs in their yards. They stop writing letters. They stop asking questions. They let the loudest lunatics define the public square. And then everyone sits around wondering why politics is dominated by extremists. Because the normal people went quiet. That's why. They got tired of the cost. Let me pause here and plug Dismantling the Republic, the role of progressive elites in America's descent into tribalism. The book deals directly with what happens when citizenship gets replaced by tribal identity, when institutions stop serving the public and start managing political categories, and when elites decide ordinary Americans are raw material to be shaped instead of citizens to be respected. If you want a sharper look at how America moved toward tribalism, bureaucratic control, institutional contempt, and managed division, read Dismantling the Republic. It's available on Amazon and other major platforms. And no, it doesn't come with a coloring page for people who need politics explained entirely through slogans. Projection is when a person takes something ugly in himself and sees it in someone else. In politics, it becomes a strategy. You accuse the other side of the thing you're doing. You accuse them first. You accuse them loudly. You accuse them constantly. Then when they point at your behavior, you act offended. This is not new. This is one of the oldest tricks in politics, and the modern left has turned it into an art form. For years now, the language of fascism has been thrown at conservatives like confetti at a parade organized by people who failed history but passed activism. Fascist, Nazi, authoritarian, white supremacist, threat to democracy, dangerous extremist, every disagreement gets escalated into an emergency. You don't support a specific immigration policy? Fascist. You think biological sex matters in law, sports, prisons, or medical language? Fascist. You believe parents should know what schools are teaching their children? Fascist. You think riots are bad? Fascist. You believe the Constitution limits government power? Somehow also fascist? At this point, the word has been inflated so badly it barely functions. If everything is fascism, nothing is. And that's convenient because once you label someone a fascist, you don't have to debate him. You don't have to answer his argument. You don't have to treat him as a citizen. You can treat him as a threat. That's the purpose of the label. It short-circuits argument. Now let's be clear. There are actual fascists. There are actual neo-Nazis. There are actual white supremacists. They exist. They're garbage. They should be opposed. But calling everyone you dislike a Nazi doesn't fight Nazism. It cheapens the term. It turns one of history's most serious political evils into a lazy insult for people who can't handle disagreement. That's not moral seriousness. That's vocabulary abuse. Projection becomes especially obvious when the same people screaming about fascism support tactics that silence dissent. They say democracy is under threat, then demand censorship. They say authoritarianism is rising, then pressure tech companies to ban their opponents. They say speech is violence, then excuse actual violence against disfavored speakers. They say diversity is strength, then build ideological monocultures where everyone must repeat the same approved phrases. They say they oppose hate, then publicly fantasize about harm coming to political opponents. They say they're anti-fascist, then show up masked, dressed in black, and ready to intimidate people in public. This is where the script gets stupid, because calling yourself anti-fascist doesn't automatically make your conduct anti-fascist. Names are cheap. Behavior tells the truth. If a group called itself the Committee for Kindness and spent every weekend smashing windows and threatening elderly women outside voting centers, would you say, well, they must be kind because it's in the name? No. You'd say, apparently the Committee for Kindness has a public relations problem and maybe a felony problem. Same principle. If you call yourself anti-fascist but your tactic is political intimidation, the name doesn't save you. A label isn't a moral shield. Here's the deeper problem. The modern left often frames politics as a battle between oppressor and oppressed. That framework is powerful because it simplifies everything. You don't need to examine policy details. You don't need to consider trade-offs. You don't need to understand law, economics, history, human nature, or constitutional limits. You just identify the oppressor and punish him. That's emotionally satisfying. It's also intellectually lazy, because once you divide the world into pure victims and pure villains, every moral restraint disappears. Why respect the right of an oppressor? Why allow an oppressor to speak? Why debate an oppressor? Why tolerate an oppressor on campus? Why let an oppressor keep his job? Why let an oppressor publish, teach, own a business, hold office, or live peacefully in a society? See how fast that goes downhill? That's the danger. The oppressor labor becomes a permission slip. Once someone is categorized as morally contaminated, normal rules stop applying. That's how decent people convince themselves to do indecent things. This is why projection is so useful. If you can convince yourself that your opponent is the authoritarian, then your authoritarian response feels defensive. If you can convince yourself your opponent is violent, then your violent feels protective. If you can convince yourself your opponent is dangerous, then your intimidation feels necessary. If you can convince yourself your opponent is hateful, then your hatred feels righteous. That's the psychological move, and it's poison. The right has its own version of this too. There are conservatives who see all liberals as communist. There are people who think every government program is Stalinism. There are people who use Marxist the same way the left uses fascist, as a verbal club instead of an argument. That's sloppy. But the reason the left's version deserves attention here is because left-wing institutions dominate many of the cultural spaces where speech norms get set. Academia, entertainment, publishing, newsrooms, nonprofit activism, corporate training, tech moderation, professional credentialing. When the people controlling those spaces adopt intimidation logic, it affects the whole country. It doesn't stay in one protest. It becomes institutional culture. That's how you get a society where one side can openly say, punch a Nazi, then quietly expand the definition of Nazi until it includes a suburban mother at a school board meeting. That's how you get a society where hate speech becomes whatever the loudest activist faction says it is. That's how you get a society where disagreement over policy is treated like violence. And once speech becomes violence, violence against speech becomes easier to justify. That's the trap. People need to understand something. A republic can't survive if every disagreement becomes a moral emergency. A republic can't survive if every election is treated as the last election. A republic can't survive if every opponent is Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Satan, or some combination assembled in the basement of MSNBC. The public mind can't stay in emergency mode forever. Eventually, people either radicalize or shut down. Neither outcome is healthy. Projection also allows people to avoid self-examination. If the fascists are always over there, then you never have to ask whether your own methods are becoming authoritarian. If the threat is always the other side, then your side never has to repent, correct, restrain, or apologize. That's how movements become dangerous. Not because they start with evil intentions, because they lose the ability to criticize themselves. A movement that can't criticize itself becomes a church, a political church, and political churches burn heretics. Maybe not literally at first. At first, they cancel them, they shame them, they isolate them, they remove their platforms, they pressure their employees, they turn their friends against them, they make examples out of them, then they claim it was accountability. This is why the phrase speaking truth to power has become almost comical. A lot of the people saying it now aren't speaking truth to power. They're speaking power's preferred language. When university administrators, corporate HR departments, major media outlets, celebrity culture, nonprofit money, and tech platforms all enforce the same ideological boundaries, you're not a brave rebel for repeating the approved slogans. You're the hall monitor. You're the volunteer deputy of the ruling social order. You're not punching up. You're helping the powerful manage speech. That's not rebellion. That's compliance with attitude. The real rebel today is often the person who says, no. No, I won't pretend words are violence. No, I won't call censorship safety. No, I won't agree that disagreement is hate. No, I won't let mobs decide truth. No, I won't surrender my conscience because your side has better access to institutional punishment. That's the person who threatens the system. Not because he's violent, because he refuses to kneel. And systems built on compliance hate refusal more than anything. Now let's talk about social media, because no modern discussion of intimidation is complete without mentioning the little outrage machines everyone carries in their pocket. Social media didn't invent human stupidity. It just gave it a distribution network. Before social media, if you had a stupid opinion, you could ruin Thanksgiving dinner. Now you can ruin your life before lunch. Progress. The digital mob works differently from the street mob, but the logic is the same. Find the target, define the offense, amplify the outrage, demand punishment, pressure institutions, reward compliance, move to the next target. That's the cycle. It's fast, it's emotional, it's usually sloppy, and it gives people the intoxicating feeling of moral power without requiring patience, evidence, or responsibility. You can destroy someone's reputation with one viral post and then go make coffee like you participated in justice. That's not courage, that's distance-enabled cruelty. Cancel culture is often defended by saying nobody is owed a platform. True, nobody is owed a platform, but that's not the issue. The issue is whether political mobs should be able to pressure every platform, employer, publisher, university, payment processor, bank, and public institution into cutting off people who express disfavored views. A free society doesn't require everyone to host every speaker, but a free society can't function when coordinated mobs create a climate where institutions fear association with dissent. That's the difference. And yes, it matters, because when one controversial person is punished, thousands of normal people watch and adjust their behavior. They don't need to be told. They understand the message. Keep your mouth shut. The J.K. Rowling situation is a useful example because she's not some anonymous person with no resources. She's wealthy, famous, successful, hard to erase, and even she became a major target for sustained public condemnation, professional distancing, social media backlash, and even formal complaints over her views on sex and gender. Now, you can agree or disagree with Rowling. That's not the point. The point is that the reaction showed how certain topics become unspeakable unless you use the approved language. The goal wasn't just to rebut her. The goal was to make her position socially radioactive. And if that can happen to someone with her level of fame and money, what do you think happens to a teacher, nurse, office worker, student, coach, librarian, or small business owner? They don't fight. They shut up. They watch the public punishment and learn the rule. This is the real function of cancellation. The target is visible. The audience is invisible. The target is punished. The audience is trained. That's why public shaming works. It creates examples. It teaches everyone else where the boundaries are, and those boundaries are often vague on purpose, because vague rules create fear. If people know exactly what's forbidden, they can avoid it. But if the rules are constantly changing, people become cautious about everything. They self-censor. They avoid jokes. They avoid policy discussions. They avoid controversial facts. They avoid honest questions. They speak in dead corporate language because dead corporate language is safe. And then everyone wonders why public discourse sounds like it was written by a committee of lawyers trapped in an elevator. The phrase safety has done a lot of work here. Safety used to mean protection from actual threats, physical violence, harassment, direct intimidation, real danger. Now, in many activist circles, safety has expanded to include emotional comfort, ideological validation, and freedom from hearing arguments you dislike. That change is massive. Because once safety includes emotional discomfort, almost any speech can be classified as unsafe. A historical argument can be unsafe. A biological claim can be unsafe. A joke can be unsafe. A policy proposal can be unsafe. A religious belief can be unsafe. A book can be unsafe. A speaker can be unsafe, and if something is unsafe, then suppressing it becomes protection. See the trick? The language of care becomes the machinery of control. The digital mob also thrives on speed. Real judgment takes time. You need context, you need evidence, you need intent, you need proportion, you need to ask whether the accusation is true. You need to ask whether the punishment fits the offense. Social media hates all of that. Too slow. Too boring. Too human. The mob wants instant judgment. Someone posts a clip. Someone adds a caption. Someone declares the villain. Somebody demands action. Then everyone piles on before anyone knows what happened. By the time the context emerges, the punishment's already started. And even if the accusation turns out to be exaggerated, misleading, or false, the correction never travels as far as the outrage. That's why digital mobs are so dangerous. They punish first and understand later, if ever. And again, the left isn't the only side that does this. Right-wing social media mobs exist. They boycott, they swarm, they harass. They create outrage cycles, they call for firings. They do many of the same things, but the left's version often has more institutional backing. When a left-wing outrage campaign begins, it frequently finds sympathetic ears inside universities, HR departments, newsrooms, entertainment companies, activist nonprofits, and professional associations. That's institutional access, changes the power dynamic. A right-wing mob may rage online. A left-wing mob often has someone inside the building ready to open the door. That's the difference. One of the most dishonest moves in the debate is pretending cancellation is just criticism. No, criticism is criticism. Cancellation is organized punishment. Criticism says your argument is wrong. Cancellation says you shouldn't be allowed to make that argument in public. Criticism answers speech with speech. Cancellation answers speech with pressure campaigns. Criticism assumes the public can judge. Cancellation assumes the public must be protected from hearing. Those aren't the same thing. People pretending they're the same thing are either dishonest or not thinking clearly. And as usual, the country is overstocked on both. Social media also rewards extremism because extremism gets engagement. Nuance doesn't go viral. Here's a balanced analysis of a complex constitutional issue doesn't perform as well as this man's a fascist monster and must be stopped. Algorithms reward emotion. Anger, fear, disgust, humiliation, tribal identity. That means the platform environment pushes people toward sharper, uglier, more simplistic content, and political activists adapt. They learn that calm argument disappears. Moral panic spreads, so they produce moral panic over and over until public life becomes a contest to see who can scream danger the loudest. This is how ordinary disagreement becomes radicalized. A person hears a policy argument, then the algorithm shows him the most extreme version of the other side. Then he starts believing that extreme version represents everyone. Then he becomes more extreme in response. Then his opponent sees his extremism and becomes more extreme too. Now both sides think they're defending themselves. Both sides think they're responding to danger. Both sides think the other side started it. And social media keeps feeding the cycle because conflict pays better than sanity. That's the part people don't want to face. The machines don't care if the country comes apart. The platforms care about attention. Political rage is attention. And we keep feeding the machine because apparently humans looked at cigarettes, cable news, and slot machines and thought, can we combine these and add strangers yelling at each other? The digital mob isn't less serious because it happens online. Online pressure becomes real-world consequence. Jobs are lost, events are canceled, books are pulled, classes are investigated, businesses are damaged, families are harassed, people are threatened, normal citizens are trained to hide their views. That's real. The method may be digital, but the result is social control. And when that control is used to enforce ideological conformity, we're back to the same old problem. Different tools, same instinct, make dissent too costly, make silence safer. A healthy society teaches citizens to argue. An unhealthy society teaches citizens to report each other. A healthy society teaches resilience. An unhealthy society teaches fragility. A healthy society says, hear the argument and answer it. An unhealthy society says, find the person's employer. That's where we are. And if that doesn't bother you, it should. Because today the mob may like your opinion. Tomorrow the rules may change. Then you'll find out very quickly that mobs don't have friends. They have targets. This is a good place to mention the Blood-Stained Banner, a look at the failures of socialism and communism. That book looks at the political movements that promised liberation and produced repression, misery, surveillance, censorship, and mass death. It's about the danger of ideologies that place the future above the individual, the collective above the conscience, and the revolutionary certainty above human life. If you want a hard reminder of what happens when political movements decide morality gives them permission to control everything, read The Blood-Stained Banner. Available on Amazon and other major platforms. Some books comfort you. This one should make you suspicious. Good. You should be. Now we need to talk about where this goes. Because intimidation doesn't stay contained. It escalates. That's what intimidation does. If shouting works, people shout more. If blocking doors works, people block more doors. If doxing works, people dox more targets. If violence gets rewarded with cancellation, people learn that violence is effective. And once violence becomes effective, some people will use it. This is why political leaders, media figures, activists, professors, celebrities, and ordinary citizens need to stop playing games with political violence. Condemn it. All of it. Left, right, no ideology, no clear ideology, foreign-inspired, religious, racial, environmental, anti-government, anti-police, anti-capitalist, white supremacist, communist, anarchist, whatever costume it wears this week, condemn it. No wink, no context, no, but you have to understand, no selective outrage, no funeral face speeches when your side is hit, and clever little excuses when your side hits back. The country is already polarized enough. Most Americans now believe political violence is increasing. Large numbers of Americans think the two parties can't even agree on basic facts. That's not a minor problem. That's a civic emergency, because facts are the ground under public argument. If we can't agree on basic reality, then politics becomes pure tribal struggle. Your side, my side, your source, my source, your dead, my dead, your violence, my resistance. That's how a republic breaks. Not always with one dramatic collapse. Sometimes it breaks because citizens no longer share enough trust to govern themselves. This is why the brown shirt comparison matters. Again, not because every left-wing activist is a Nazi. That's stupid. The comparison matters because political street intimidation is one of the warning signs of democratic decay. When citizens lose faith in argument, they start reaching for force. When activists lose faith in persuasion, they start reaching for disruption. When institutions lose courage, they reward the most aggressive faction. When media outlets treat one side's violence as understandable and the other side's violence as existential, they teach people that principle is fake. Then everyone starts preparing for politics as conflict instead of politics as argument. And when politics become conflict, veterans pay attention because we know what conflict does. It strips away fantasy, it punishes delusion, it doesn't care how righteous you felt when you started. America isn't Weimar Germany. People need to stop making lazy one-to-one comparisons. The United States has a different constitutional structure, different culture, different history, different geography, different economy, different military tradition, and different civic habits. But that doesn't mean it's immune to political decay. No country is immune. No republic has magic armor. Rome didn't, Weimar didn't, the Soviet Union didn't. Every society is made of habits. Habits of trust, habits of restraint, habits of law, habits of speech, habits of patience, habits of losing elections without burning the system down. When those habits break, institutions alone aren't enough. A constitution is paper of the people no longer believe in limits. A courtroom is an architecture if citizens no longer respect law. An election is procedure if half the country thinks the other half is illegitimate. Civilization is not self-executing. You have to maintain it. Apparently that was not clear, so here we are. The left has a special problem because it often presents itself as the moral guardian of democracy. It says it's defending inclusion, defending tolerance, defending marginalized people, defending truth, defending science, defending democracy itself. But a movement that defends democracy by silencing opponents isn't defending democracy. It's redefining democracy as a rule by the morally approved. That's dangerous, because once democracy means our side wins because our side is good, elections become obstacles, speech becomes danger, opposition becomes illegitimate, courts become tools, police become tools, schools become tools, corporations become tools, everything becomes political enforcement, and the ordinary citizen becomes a subject again. Not a citizen, a subject. Managed, corrected, trained, warned, punished. The right needs discipline too. The right can't respond to left-wing intimidation by copying it. That's how you lose the argument while pretending to win the fight. If the left shouts down speakers, the right should defend speech. If the left uses mobs, the right should build institutions. If the left uses cancellation, the right should build alternatives and protect due process. If the left lies, the right should document facts. If the left threatens the right, it should prosecute threats under law, not invent its own mob justice. The answer to brown shirt tactics isn't red shirt tactics. It's law, order, courage, speech, organization, memory, and refusing to be trained into silence. There's a hard truth here. Some people aren't persuadable. Some people don't want debate. Some people don't want dialogue. Some people don't want coexistence. They want compliance. You need to understand the difference. You don't negotiate with the person who thinks your right to speak is the problem. You defeat that argument publicly, repeatedly, without apology. You expose the tactic. You name the coercion. You defend the principle. You refuse to play the emotional hostage game. That doesn't mean being reckless. It doesn't mean being cruel. It doesn't mean screaming back like a drunk raccoon in a dumpster. It means standing firm. No, you may not silence me. No, you may not redefine my words as violence. No, you may not punish disagreement as harm. No, you may not use your trauma, your ideology, your degree, your job title, your committee, your hashtag, or your moral panic to veto my rights. That's how free citizens talk. A lot of people confuse peace with silence. They think if nobody is arguing, society is healthy. Wrong. A society where people are afraid to argue isn't peaceful. It's suppressed. There's a difference. Real peace allows disagreement. Real peace allows debate. Real peace allows tension without violence. Real peace doesn't require everyone to lie. A society full of people whispering in private and performing in public isn't stable. It's brittle, and brittle things shatter. The future depends on whether people recover the courage to disagree like adults. That means hearing things you hate. That means defending rights for people you dislike. That means allowing speakers you would never invite to dinner. That means refusing to join mobs even when the mob targets someone unpopular. That means asking whether the accusation is true before you grab your pitchfork. That means remembering that today's acceptable opinion can become tomorrow's forbidden thought. It means understanding that rights are not rewards for good behavior. Rights are protections against power, especially when power is popular, especially when power is angry, especially when power says it's acting for your own good. Political intimidation is seductive because it feels strong, but it's weak. It's what people use when they can't persuade. It's what movements use when they fear scrutiny. It's what ideologues use when they know open debate might expose the cracks. If your position is strong, make the case. If your facts are solid, present them. If your moral argument is sound, defend it. If your opponent is wrong, prove it. But if your first move is to silence him, you've already confessed more than you realize. You've confessed fear. And that's the final hammer blow before we close. The real test of political movement is not how it treats allies. That's easy. The real test is how it treats opposition. Does it tolerate opposition? Does it debate opposition? Does it protect opposition's rights, or does it try to crush opposition with mobs, labels, social punishment, and institutional force? By that test, certain factions of the modern left have a serious problem. They call themselves defenders of democracy while behaving like democracy is too dangerous to allow. They call themselves tolerant while treating dissent as contamination. They call themselves anti-fascist while using intimidation as a political tool. And if nobody says that clearly, the tactic spreads. So I'm saying it clearly. If your politics requires people to shut up, you're not the good guy. If your movement needs fear to win, your movement is morally sick. If your answer to speech is intimidation, you've left the realm of democratic argument and entered the politics of coercion. You can call it activism, you can call it justice, you can call it safety, you can call it anti-fascism, but the tactics tell the truth, and the truth is ugly. Before the outro, let me plug The Unmaking of the American Citizen, Neoliberalism, Identity Politics, and the Conservative Renewal. This book deals with how Americans stopped being treated as citizens with rights, duties, memory, and national inheritance, and started being managed as demographic categories, voting blocks, market segments, and grievance groups. That shift matters because once citizenship gets broken into tribes, the republic becomes easier to manipulate. If today's episode made you think about how mobs, institutions, and political language reshape public life, then The Unmaking of the American Citizen belongs on your reading list. Find it on Amazon and other major platforms. Read it before someone tells you citizenship is outdated and obedience is progress. Let's wrap this up. The term brown shirt shouldn't be thrown around casually. History deserves better than lazy insults. But tactics matter, and when political actors use intimidation, disruption, mob pressure, threats, and punishment to silence opponents, the comparison isn't random. It's a warning. The original brown shirts used street power to make political opposition dangerous. Modern movements don't have to copy the uniform to copy the logic. They can use campuses, they can use social media, they can use HR departments, they can use professional associations, they can use activist networks. They can use institutional cowardice. They can use reputational fear. Different tools, same objective. Control speech by making dissent costly. This episode isn't an excuse for the right. It's not a blank check for conservative stupidity. It's not a claim that one side owns all political virtue. The right has its own radicals, cowards, grifters, conspiracy addicts, and keyboard warriors who think posting in all caps is a substitute for courage. But the left has spent years positioning itself as the guardian of tolerance while tolerating a shocking amount of intolerance from its own side. That contradiction needs to be called out, because a movement that can't see its own authoritarian habits will always excuse them. The public square has to remain open, messy, loud, offensive, annoying, uncomfortable. That's the price of liberty. If you want a society where nobody says anything offensive, you don't want freedom. You want control. And the people promising that control will always tell you it's for safety, for justice, for democracy, for the vulnerable, for the future. That's how control sells itself. It never says, I'm here to rule you. It says, I'm here to protect you. And then it starts deciding what you're allowed to hear. The answer isn't silence. The answer isn't fear. The answer isn't mob versus mob. The answer is principled resistance. Defend speech, condemn violence, expose projection, refuse intimidation, argue hard, stand firm. Don't surrender the language of democracy to people who think democracy means shutting everyone else up. Because once the mob gets to decide who may speak, the republic is already wounded. Once citizens start whispering instead of arguing, liberty is already retreating. Once institutions reward intimidation, the next mob is already forming. And once political movements learn that fear works, they don't stop using it because you ask nicely. They stop when decent people refuse to obey. So here's the final line. If you have to silence your opponent to protect your idea isn't strong. It's fragile. And if your movement needs intimidation to survive, then your movement isn't defending democracy. It's practicing for power. This has been Sean Thinking Out Loud. I'm Sean Armstrong. Think clearly, stand your ground, and don't let cowards with slogans teach you to fear your own voice.
Every time I tried to stand, they pushed me down. Now I've had enough, can't take it all around. It's time to be strong, time to be clear. No more being used, it's time